So Nolan, when's the first time you remember seeing this?
I was probably 2 years old. I remember playing in this thing as a little kid, and I didn't realize which one Peter was talking about when we first suggested the idea until we opened up the barn, and there it was, and I was like, oh, I used to play in this thing.
Yeah. So this is pretty special then for you to work on this. And
as a kid, I don't think I ever saw myself driving, or any of us driving this thing down the rails.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
The people that I'm talking to rebuilt this speeder in 2022, including a conversion to narrow gauge. I interviewed them at the end of a really fun day of observing and documenting this speeder in action on the Cowichan Valley Railway. That's a narrow gauge railway at the BC Forest Discovery Centre in North Cowichan on Vancouver Island. I was happy to learn more about this speeder's history, how it came to the Forest Discovery Center, and the work that was done on it in recent years to make it operational. I'm thankful to these people for their time and having good conversation with them, and them providing me some old photos and video clips of the speeder back in the days when it was on display and being rebuilt.
So, somewhere BC Rail purchased it, so the research goes.
We're looking at the numbers on this, and the numbers are actually underneath some of the plates. The numbers correlate to the CN rail more than the BC. So it's possible it was one of CN's.
Okay.
It's a rail car built in 1981, just before it became wooding.
Yeah.
So this is actually a rail car, even though they look like a wooding.
Oh, meaning that's the company name. What a great generic company name. Yeah. So then found its way up to...
So it went up to Nanaimo Lakes on the Crown Zellerbach Railway.
Yeah.
And Crown Zellerbach had it at the end of their operation. How much they used it, or if McMillan Blodell used it, is kind of hard to tell. It kind of arrived at the end of operations.
Yeah.
It sat for 5 years in the old town site there of Nanaimo Lakes.
Yeah.
I believe in the back of what they had, a little tiny fire hall there.
Okay.
And about 25 years ago, it was offered to the museum here.
Okay.
So it was picked up and it was on display for 22, 23 years.
And that's in the building where you come in, the admissions, by the gift shop.
It was there for a few years, and then it was in storage for a few years.
Okay.
Getting beaten around.
During our conversation, Peter gave me the correct terminology to describe the speeder's gauge.
It's a modified narrow gauge speeder.
It is?
So
a modified standard gauge. Modified to narrow gauge.
That's right. Okay, that's the terminology is based on.
And now Peter tells us about the modification project.
So we decided to see if it was feasible to convert it to narrow gauge.
Yeah.
And it was Nolan, myself, Victor all helped, and took us a couple of months working 1 day a week.
Yeah.
On volunteer time.
Yeah. And fixing the axles or repairing some of those things.
We cut the axles so it would fit. It was originally 56.5-inch gauge, and we converted it to 36-inch gauge. So we would have cut the axle a little more than 20 inches.
Okay, you redid a new floor.
Redesigned the floor.
Yeah. Same engine?
Same engine, same transmission.
Yeah.
Yeah.
On January 4th, 2022, the project was set to begin, and Nolan posed with the speeder in its standard gauge format outside the shop. 2 days later, these views show the wheels and axles off and the speeder up on a temporary trolley. It would stay up there for about a month. Here are a few views of the rear axle. Near the end of the first month of the project, here's how the speeder looked in the shop. There was still a lot of work coming up. Nolan is holding the new additional cross member fabricated for this project. Before fitting the new floor, the existing middle cross member was moved forward, and one new extra cross member had to be added aft. It needed to clear the drive shaft and be modified to clear the brake linkage on the bottom edge and the bearing blocks on the side. Here we can see where wheels were removed for the narrowing of the frame. I'll show the axle modifications in just a moment, but for now, here's a view of one of the results. The new axle was installed with bearing support rail moved in by 10¼ inches on each side. No frame members were cut. In our conversation, I mentioned how the speeder appears to be really useful because two people can lift it and turn it around at any place on the track. Well, that comment resulted in Peter explaining a bit about the difference between the front and rear axles.
And you work in both directions, but it also turns really nice.
Yeah, it turns quite easily.
Yeah. Yeah. All right.
If you lift it from the right end.
If it all works
You
out.
show a
It's tricky,
quick
right?
clip of that in there.
Because the motor end is heavier than the other end.
Here's the funny moment that Peter referred to when you try lifting up the heavy engine end and turning on the rear end.
Yeah.
If you turn it on the motor, the axle under the motor end is called a broken axle, so it rotates on itself.
Yeah.
So the wheels can turn freely.
Yeah.
The back drive axle is a solid axle, so it would actually be harder to turn it that way.
Yeah.
And here is a photo collage of the axles. First, the front axle, as Peter explained, it's called a broken axle. On the left side, you see it at the standard gauge length. In the middle, after, with the 10.25 inches cut from either end, and you can see those cut pieces there in the middle. And here's an overhead view of the modified front axle. It's assembled with brass keepers installed inside. An outer steel tube holds everything in line. The bearings also visible, as well as collars with set screws to stop sideways movement. This is where I mention that I'm very thankful to Peter for the full descriptions that he wrote for me for the photos that he provided. And here's the rear axle collage. On the left, original, taken apart, and on the right, it's been cut and remachined, and you can see the two pieces on the top and the bottom that have been removed, 10.25 inches each. And here's an overhead view of the reassembled rear axle. The drive box has been cleaned, and it's got new oil seals and new oil. This next section is really interesting. Here are the wheels without the brakes. And here's a view of the final brake installation. Here's a view that shows the brake linkage shortened, installed, and operational. Now let's look at the engine. Here's a video from January 6, 2022 at the start of the project. And here's a clip from about a month and a half later.
3, 2, 1.
On March 25th, 2022, there was a lot of work done on the engine system, and there were a lot of photos taken on that day. Here's the rear end view of the speeder. And here we are back inside the cab with a series of views of the engine system on that day. And at the end of the day, here's the engine cleaned up with the new battery box floor. April 15th, 2022, the first time since the mid-1980s that the motor ran on its own. Victor is really proud of this moment. And a few days later, it was time to take it for a rip around the track. Now let's look at the project of the side floors. Here's how things looked in mid-February 2022. The floor support brackets needed to be modified. Here is the new floor design planned out in the cardboard form. Here are the new items in place before they were removed for painting. And the pieces of the new floor are painted and installed. This is the coupling pin at the rear end of the speeder. Obviously it's used when pulling the work car. Here is a collage view of both ends of the speeder near the end of the project. And you'll note that this is before the coupling pin was added to the rear of the speeder. As for me, when I visited the BC Forest Discovery Centre in July 2022, this was my first glimpse of the speeder on display outside the shop. Meanwhile, the crew was carrying on and testing out various items. And for the Labor Day weekend in 2022, when the Hillcrest No. 1 Shea rebuild project was on display for people to see, the little red speeder provided a nice extra splash of color to the scene, even though that weekend was all about the Shea.
So what do you use it for? Besides looking good, because I know when I come here as a visitor, it looks good when you have it parked on the other shop lead here, and you dress it up for the holiday train.
Yeah, it's used basically for packing equipment around, doing rail work.
Yeah.
We can drive to a good percentage of our track using pickup trucks or the tractor, but this can go to any spot on the rail. So when we're carrying some heavy equipment around, maybe drilling holes for fish plates or cutting the rail to size. If we're replacing a rail, we can pack all that equipment on our little trailer right to the spot.
Yeah.
And it saves a lot of lugging heavy stuff down into the bush somewhere.
And here's the speeder set up with a dirt container on top of the work car. It's heading to a work site near the north end of the trestle, and here's Nolan shoveling off some dirt.
So do you commonly call it a motor car or a speeder or a rail car?
Mostly it calls a speeder, but it can also be called a putt-putt. A few other various names.
All those names, jiggers and putt-putts.
Oh.
And now Victor explains a little bit of what he remembers of the speeders back when he worked on the railways in the prairies.
Well, they used them in front of the passenger train. Whenever it went down the main line, one of these had to go first.
Looking for rocks and looking for things like that?
Yeah, broken track,
all that
anything
stuff
in front of the passenger. That's where I remember.
Okay, stuff that they use a high rail truck for now.
Yeah.
I think.
And they have heaters in those.
Okay.
These were a little chilly.
Yeah. Did the visitors ask a lot of questions about it when they see it when they're going by on the visitor train, or?
They all like it.
They all
you
like
can tell
it. Yeah.
They look over here and they just think it's the neatest little thing.
My camera lens loves it in the summertime. It's just a nice splash of color.
Yeah.
So.
Riding the back of the train on occasion, I hear people say, "Oh, look at that little thing over there," and they do comment on it when they go around.
Now over on the other side of the track, you've got a little yellow rail car near where you've got a stockpile of rails. Was that also a motorized speeder, or was that likely just a little trailer,
That was motorized. That was a Fairmont.
Okay.
And we do have an engine that would fit in it.
Yeah.
Most of the drive is still there. It's just belt drive to a pulley on the rear axle. It's quite simple.
Yeah.
And the controls panels in there, most of it's still there. The brake rigging, most of it's still there. It's in rough shape, but it could be put back into service.
It's nice to see. I look at it whenever I go by.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Victor.
Thank
you, Peter. Thank you, Nolan.
Well, thank you.
The cheesy smile. The fade out. All right.
Okay.
Oh no, I forgot to hit record.
Oh
my God.
I don't have my names on this yet, so
Oh, those are mine.
don't touch them.